So our next speaker this afternoon will be Andrew Smothers. Andrew grew up in Monticello, Iowa, and will be graduating next month with a master's in divinity, at which point he'll be embarking on a worldwide adventure that Alex would be proud of. Andy's preparing for a 2-year fellowship that will take him first to New York City, then Zambia, then a handful of other countries in the global south. Little known fact about Andy includes that he holds his degree in both engineering as well as chemistry. Today, Andy is going to fill us in on his project that took him to Philadelphia and back. So please join me in welcoming Andy.
Thank you. And I wanted to start by thanking a few people, as this often ends up at the end, and sometimes we run out of time. And I want to first thank the Colonies for their great donation to this program and the ability to spend a summer doing research and to go to Philadelphia and dig through documents from the 17 and 1800s. It's been a real joy to be able to do that, and I thank them for that. To my advisor, Reverend Dr. Brad Longfield, the dean of the seminary, who took someone, as Dr. Hoffman just mentioned, who has a science and engineering background, and worked and molded them to be able to do historical research. Probably a great challenge to him. To Dr. Hoffman for his leadership over the summer and the various opportunities we had. To the seminary and university community for the various ways in which you enabled all of us to do research over the summer and continuing. And finally, the Presbyterian Historical Society as well, as they took many requests for documents from me as I spent a week in Philadelphia. And they would dig through the archives for various items. I have 3 things that I have time to talk about today. First, a little bit about Presbyterians in the 1700s. Secondly, about key issues that led to the split of the Presbyterian Church in the 1700s. And finally, a little bit about the reconciliation process that followed. As you might have noticed in your program, my original topic was the historic use of non-geographic presbyteries in the Presbyterian Church USA. This was a very large topic, as we determined after I went to Philadelphia and preparing, and I really focused in on one of these splits and then expanded it out to look at a specific time period. And I'm working now, as I prepare to write a couple papers related to this, to try to bring in ideas based on the current state of the Presbyterian Church USA and the challenges that we currently face. So a little bit about Presbyterians in the 1700s. 1683, an Irish presbytery sent Francis Makemie to the colonies to start planning churches. In 1706, there were a number of congregations that had formed, and a presbytery, the Presbytery of Philadelphia, was formed. This was the first presbytery in the colonies. And this was created as a mission presbytery. It didn't have enough money of its own, so it relied on New England colleges to provide ministers, and further beyond to what we call Great Britain today, to provide both ministers and funding for this developing church. And as then the church continued to grow, in 1716, the presbytery was divided into 3 presbyteries, and I'll show you what these terms really mean here in a moment, to form the Synod of Philadelphia, which was another level over the presbytery. So it was a very dynamic time. However, commerce within the colonies had brought new wealth. And we think of materialism as a bit of a new phenomenon today. It was something that was taking root in that time as well. People were becoming wealthy, could afford new things, and there was a decline in evangelical witness. In fact, one Boston preacher wrote, "Alas, as though nothing but the amazing thunders and lightnings and the most terrible earthquakes could awaken us. We are at this time fallen into as dead as sleep as ever." They were worried that the church was falling into a sleep and not moving forward. So I want to give you an idea what these structures that I was naming actually represent. The Presbyterian Church USA today has a number of different levels. You can imagine the congregations that exist here around Dubuque in the Presbyterian Church. We find First Presbyterian Church here in Dubuque and Westminster. Above that is a governance called the Presbytery. And above this is the Synod, and further at the national level is the General Assembly. That's really the structure of the church today. As we go back in time to 1706, we had a number of congregations, and we had only one structure above that, the Presbytery of Philadelphia. However, as the church grew further, they found They founded the Synod of Philadelphia, and there were 3 presbyteries under that: the Presbytery of Philadelphia, the Presbytery of Newcastle, and the Presbytery of Long Island. So this is really a phenomenon around Philadelphia, New York, New Jersey at that time. So keep those in mind as I go through this talk. You'll hear various different presbyteries. Presbyteries were split, combined, different things over this time. Just imagine those presbyteries as the level right above the congregation. There are 4 primary reasons that the church split, 4 areas of conflict that happened in the church. The first was an issue of church discipline. Secondly, subscription to theological and other documents. Thirdly, education. And fourthly, revival intrusions. And I'm going to focus today, because we don't have very much time, on the first of these 2, but I want to mention just briefly the other 2, and that is education was a challenge in that there were not enough schools to train new ministers for all these churches that were starting. There was a school called the Log Cabin College that was founded in 1727, and there was conflict over whether ministers from that college should be accepted into the Presbyterian Church and whether they got an education that was extensive enough. This fourth issue that I mentioned, revival intrusions, was an issue where revivals were happening, the church was growing, and there were large groups of people that would come to hear preachers that would move around the countryside. These intruded into the area of other pastors, and there was conflict over that, sometimes taking people away from congregations, in other cases spreading heresies and other issues that pastors who stayed in that area would have to deal with. So first, as I mentioned, I want to talk about church discipline. The first issue that comes up is regarding an individual called Robert Cross, who was a Scotch-Irish pastor. He was accused of committing a moral sin, and in this case, it was a sin of fornication that he was accused of. He was referred by the Presbytery of Newcastle directly to the Synod. They did not hear the case themselves. He confessed and he repented before the assembly, and he was found guilty by the Synod. And the punishment he was given was that he was barred from the pulpit from preaching for 4 Sundays. So a rather substantial sin and a rather limited punishment as a result. He even remained on a controlling committee of the Synod. So he was still very involved at the top level of church government. And as you might imagine, this brought conflict within the church. An individual, George Gillespie, another pastor, entered a formal protest. And in 1721, he tried twice unsuccessfully to have the case reconsidered. As he was unsuccessful, he then introduced an overture requesting that the next synod evaluate acts regarding synod governance and discipline. This was a time when there really was no formal policy regarding governance in the church, and these were really just meetings of ministers and in some cases elders. And this was passed with a minority protesting. The protesters at the next assembly then brought 4 conditions that they would require if they would put aside their protest. They first said that they would recognize the full executive power of the church government in presbyteries and synods, and they accepted that the church may use the keys of church government for all proper intents and purposes. The second one was that all things would be done decently and in order. If you are a Presbyterian or have been exposed to Presbyterians, this should sound familiar. We always work to do things decently and in order, though we don't always succeed, and we're known for that, for focusing on that. They then would accept acts as long as they were not imposed upon those who conscientiously dissented. So each individual had the freedom to dissent from these acts or these policies. Thirdly, directories could be recommended by synods. However, subordinate bodies might decline these directories with reason. In fact, inferior bodies might also. And fourthly, superior bodies may hear appeals and determine appeals. And this was one of the first attempts then to develop a polity for the church, or policies that the church would use for government. And this was actually a set of 4 solutions that were greatly applauded by this assembly. The subscription issue really starts in Great Britain. Presbyterian or Reformed Church existed in Scotland for some time. This was really pre-Great Britain. But in 1690, the Scottish Parliament ratified Westminster. Westminster is a large number of theological and worship and governance documents. And they ratified that as the public and avowed confession of the church, containing the sum and substance of the doctrine of the Reformed Church. So these documents actually become a part of the church's polity because of an act of the government. And in this case, the government and the church are very closely connected. The General Assembly that same year required that of those entering ministry, and in 1693, Parliament required it of all ministers, and the General Assembly accepted it as well. And the ministers then were required to state that the Westminster documents would be the confession of their faith, and that they own the doctrine therein contained to be the true doctrine, which I will constantly adhere to. It was also an issue in England. The Westminster documents actually originated in England. And in 1717, there was concern over a heresy that had existed for some time, a semi-Arianism in England. And subscription, which was long opposed in the church, was brought up at that time. And the church decided not to require subscription. The subscribers, as they are called, who wanted subscription, then left the church to form a new denomination. And I note here as well that the Westminster Assembly really never intended that these documents be subscribed to. In fact, the chair of that assembly states, "In the assembly, I gave my vote with others that the confession of faith put out by the assembly should not be either required to be sworn or subscribed to, we having been burnt in the hand in that kind before, but so as not to be publicly preached or written against." So one should not preach against the documents, but they did not have to subscribe to the documents. So that brings us to the colonies and the challenges in the 1700s. In 1724, the Presbytery of Newcastle expressed adherence to the Westminster Confession and indicated that candidates for ministry needed to sign it. In 1729, the Adopting Act was passed by the Synod. Individuals, according to this act, had to subscribe and accept the documents, but might scruple or take difference with specific points. And then the assembly could determine whether these points were non-essential or unnecessary. And their determination on that would then determine whether the minister could be a part of the assembly. In 1730, the Presbytery of Newcastle then pushed this further, requiring verbal subscription without qualification. They would no longer allow scruples or disagreements to be presented. In 1732, the Donegal Presbytery followed. And in 1735, the first heresy case in the colonial Presbyterian church was put forward under these documents. Samuel Hemphill was accused of a theological error. He had previously subscribed to the Westminster documents without scrupling or taking any difference at all, and he plagiarized a number of sermons that he preached, and charges were brought before a commission of the Synod in 1735, and he was found guilty of a number of different heretical viewpoints, and certainly the plagiarism did not help at all. He was accused in the end of a deistic drift. He had drifted away from what was considered Orthodox Christianity. In 1736 then, the Synod reinterpreted this Adopting Act, which required subscription but allowed ministers to put forth differences. They confirmed the adherence to the Westminster documents. They inventoried the scruples of the ministers present. Only about 25% of the ministers were present in this assembly when this was happening. So 75% were not present. The liberal ministers were generally not present. And they limited then the scruples to those that were expressed in the assembly at that time. And those were all generally related to issues of the civil magistrate's authority over the Synod. This was really something that comes from England and didn't apply in the governance structure in the states. 1741, protest was submitted requiring all elders, all members of the assembly, ministers and elders, to subscribe to the Westminster documents according to the Adopting Act and the reinterpretation. Nearly half the assembly objected, and they were voted out of the assembly, and they formed their own assembly. Again, during that time, many ministers were absent. The Presbytery of New York was really a voice of reconciliation in this process, or at least attempted to. In 1742 and 3, they worked to reconcile the two parties without success, and eventually in 1745, they joined what's called the New Side. The old side was the remnant that remained in the Presbytery of Philadelphia, and the New Side was the newly formed Synod of New York. 4 years later, from this point, in 1749, there were still major issues between the two parties. The old side was unwilling to withdraw their protest of 1741, and they were also desiring presbyteries to be reconstituted in their 1741 form. And this would have given them an advantage in numbers in the assembly, and therefore the new side was unwilling to accept that. However, reconciliation finally became possible in 1758. So the split in 41, now reunification in 58. The revivals that I mentioned briefly had subsided. The log cabin college that I'd also mentioned had closed. The new side had expanded substantially, due in part to their flexibility in finding ministers, and the old side was now willing to remove their protestation of 1741. And the plan of union that brought them back together generally affirmed the Adopting Act of 1729. They also attempted to address future schism in including, when any matter is determined by a major vote, every member shall either actively concur with or passively submit to such determination, or if his conscience permit him to do neither, he shall peaceably withdraw from our communion without accepting to make any schism. So it tried to invite ministers, if they had difference with the decision of the assembly, to depart peacefully and not take others with them or even congregations with them. And that was the reconciliation then. Thank you.